Welcome back. It's Swing Pass season award time. We already handed out the 2024 UFA trophy to the Minnesota Wind Chill, and now it's time to hang some flowers and accolades on all of the individual players who had fantastic seasons throughout the 2024 campaign. I am Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. Per usual, we've got an absolute ton to get to in this episode, so we will waste no time and get right into the individual awards for the 2024 UFA season. All of these selections are available to read along with a slew of articles on the watchufa.com website, but Cam and I will be here to break down and contribute a little bit of our own opinions about this ceremonious occasion. You know, I think it's something of a new development in Ultimate Frisbee in general to kind of award individual accolades. I know Ultraworld does it for club divisions in college. We do it here in the professional level, but this isn't really a long-standing tradition, right, Cam? Like to sort of single out in such a team game individuals who had exceptional seasons.
Yeah, you even go back to like the early years of back when we were the AUDL, right? The awards were just like first team all league, and that was pretty much it. And then there was like a first team and a second team. Like as we've gotten further into this, naming MVPs, finding defensive player of the years, all these things, it's definitely gotten a lot more intricate. But I think that just shows like with the growth of the league, it's just not so cut and dry anymore. And we'll talk a little bit about this as we go throughout the episode, just like how hard it was to come up with like your list for who made these teams and who got these individual awards. Because in some situations, I think we felt like there was a clear maybe winner. And in a lot of situations, it's a lot more messy and muddy to try to figure out exactly who deserves to be on these teams, because we're in a luxurious position right now where it feels like lots of players could be there. It's not so cut and dry as it was in the early days of the league, where it felt like there were clearly certain players that were having the biggest impact.
Yeah, and to your point about the kind of expansion of these awards, the teams themselves, I mean, we just added a third Team All-UFA the other season, the expansion of second teams in both the rookie and all defensive teams, most improved coach of the year. Like these are all relatively new innovations. I don't think we had coach of the year even before we took the pandemic break year in 2020. So, these are all very new traditions in our league. And I think it's really interesting to work season through season on the ballot. I've been doing this now for, I think, 8 years. I've been voting on all UFA MVP candidates. And in 2024, it was the most difficult ballot. I mean, we'll definitely get into that, particularly when it comes to the all defensive and all rookie teams, just how many candidates got on different ballots across the league. But there's just so much to take into consideration in these kinds of selections. And I don't want to water it down too much with this kind of mealy speak about what it is to vote and sort of what we mean by the V and MVP and all this stuff. But just suffice it to say that in 2024, it felt like there was maybe 80 players who deserved to be in consideration in one form or another on these specific teams. And we've narrowed it down to 45 selections in particular for all the various individual accolades and team awards. But there's just so many more deserving, I think, nominations or honorable mentions, or however you want to put it, in a season like this. Again, as we've typified 1,000 times, and we'll get into it in another episode in the next week or two, it's been chaos season. There hasn't really been a pronounced individual or team that has dominated front to back. And that's new for us. We're kind of used to being at this point in the season and being like, all right, who are the New York Empire players and coaches and franchise members who sort of deserve their flowers, and then let's work our way from there. This year, it's completely topsy-turvy.
Yeah, without a dominant team, you kind of looked at different points of the season of like who could be the MVP or who could be this or that, right? We were talking early in the season about Jordan Kerr and Anders Jungs potentially being MVP candidates, and neither one of them even finished in the top 3 of the voting, and one of them didn't even make an all UFA team, and I think that just shows how different this year was, because you're right, going into the last few years, like we knew that Ryan Oscar and Jack Williams and Ben Yacht and Jeff Babbitt were all going to be in contention for like the MVP award. They were all going to make one of the, first, second team all UFA. There was never really any question about that. And then coming into this year with so many, we had 4 or 5 different teams throughout the season that at one point we thought might be the best team in the league. The team that ended up winning the whole thing was never considered by anyone to be the best team in the league, which is probably maybe the first time that's ever happened. If not the first, definitely one of very few times.
I would say
happened.
Madison 2018 kind of got the same sort of derisive accolades from the rest of the league. It's always Central Division. You should know, Cam.
Well, I would say that 2018 team, though, they went in on a heater to the playoffs, whereas
they did.
Whereas this Minnesota team, the most recent thing we'd seen them doing going into the playoffs against like good competition was just not being super competitive necessarily. And so maybe even in my mind, even kind of more shocking might not be the right word, but definitely less a team I definitely would have picked way fewer times than that 2018 Radicals team. But regardless, the chaos of the season really lent itself to chaos in the voting for the awards, I think. And I think that's reflected in just, as you said, how many honorable mentions there were.
Yeah, and maybe not the chaos as we talk about these individual awards at the top of this episode, but definitely as we get into the teams. And so I want to brook us into the biggest award of the entire individual ballot, the Most Valuable Player Award. And in case you haven't heard the news already, it will be 2-time now reigning MVP Jeff Babbitt winning his second straight MVP, but now with the Boston Glory in 2024 after winning with the New York Empire in 2023. Lucas Ambrose deservedly got a couple of first place votes in this particular selection. Brett Halsmeyer also getting honorable mentions and finishing as a finalist. But I've got to say, for my own 2 cents, this felt like a Babbitt pre-made award, given the kind of storyline and everything else that went into the season. Boston upending New York in their first round playoff battle. I wouldn't quite call it an upset, given that the Glory were hosting the Empire, but given history, given all the drama and stakes at hand, that definitely felt like a kind of up from under victory for the Glory, and particularly given the way that Babbitt clinched that game-winning goal with under 10 seconds to play, and then Boston eventually closing out New York's Hail Mary. It just felt front to back since Babbitt announced his signing on April 1st that this has kind of been the Babbitt and Boston season. It felt kind of like that was the fulcrum on which all of the other action was predicated.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, he finishes one off. If you want to talk about just like raw stats, he finishes one behind Garrett Martin and Lucas Ambrose, who tied for the lead in plus minus. So he was near the top of the league in plus minus. One thing that's interesting about him is I think we've mentioned this on a previous episode at some point, but like him winning MVP last year was really one of the first times where we took some, at least in a while, where there was a player who really wasn't putting up basically any throwing numbers. We really had seemed to trend into people who maybe were primarily throwers, or at least were still putting up large throwing numbers as MVP winners. He finishes the season, if you want to talk about like just statistically, less than double-digit assists, like 7 total assists on the season. But the other things he's able to do, right, the 40-plus goals, the 20-plus blocks, where he's playing a large majority of his points on offense and is able to get the disc back so many times, obviously winning end of quarters, whether it's defensively or offensively, and really just transforming this Boston team from a team who was almost in the playoffs on accident in 2023. Like they just kind of woke up and found themselves there, and clearly unprepared for like what that playoff run was going to look like. And then coming in the next year for a long time, looking like they might be able to take the 1 seed, eventually taking the 2 seed, but then beating New York Empire. If you weren't already voting Jeff Babbitt for MVP before the playoffs started, the fact that he had a good game in the playoff game and then had the game clinching goal with barely any time left on the clock, that I think for a lot of people kind of cemented it at that point. Like, this guy is the MVP. It would have taken Brett Holzmeyer probably or Lucas Ambrose carrying their teams to a championship at that point to kind of usurp Babbitt from his MVP throne.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different ways to break down Babbitt. Obviously, there's the goals, second overall in blocks in 2024. You talk about the lack of throwing statistics, but to me, the number that jumps out to most readily is the completions plus lack of errors.
Yep.
He still finished with 261 completions for the 2024 season and 14 starts compared to 3 throwaways. That's a 98% completion rate. He was in the backfield and facilitating so much in this Boston offense that even with the sort of paucity of production numbers as like a scoring thrower, he was so vital to the raising of the floor for that glory offense that was so visible in this season. And to me, again, like that lack of error, that's the new brand for Babbitt. I know we love the buzzer beaters. I know we love the flying blocks, the massive skies, the just almost WWE size that he brings to every single game. But the thing that I notice about him in his career is his ability to completely eliminate mistakes. I mean, he's got what? I think he's got 1 drop in the past 3 seasons or something like that. I mean, this is just somebody who comes in with a completely different kind of mental focus. And you could see that just ebb into the entirety of the Boston franchise this year, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to get too far into one of my normal diatribes about the history of this league and whatever else, but I think we have a recency bias when it comes to the successes of the New York Empire. We think of them as this team in 2023 and 2022, a championship weekend, just blowing out the best in their competition. And rightfully so. They were the most talented team by heads and shoulders in anyone in the UFA. But where the Empire got started was not some kind of big show, explosion, highlight factory. It was eking out a bunch of victories. That's how that dynasty got started. And that was because they had a quarter finisher like Babbitt, they had a focus player like Babbitt, and they had that kind of foundation to their team. And I can't look at how the Empire started their ascent in 2018, winning against DC in that brutal typhoon game in the first round against the Breeze, where neither team scored in the fourth quarter. New York advances. They beat Toronto for the first time ever in the 2018 East Division Championship game. They squeaked through that one in Toronto. In 2019, when they had their first undefeated season, wasn't like they were just crushing opponents. They had a bunch of late game kind of heroic finishes. This is the legacy of Babbitt. And to see him transfer teams, go to a divisional rival, and basically start all of that over again, see Boston win in all of these ways that aren't necessarily dominant, but definitely show a power and a strength to their performances. That's what makes him an MVP to me. The way in which the DNA of the Glory changed in 2024 because they brought this guy aboard. And it shouldn't be without mention all of the other talent that they also got on board as a result of bringing on the 2023 MVP and Jeff Babbitt. That just made him such a clear distinction for me. I think there's plenty of cases to be made for Lucas Ambrose too. I think he's very deserving of kind of the nomination and the finalist. Same with Brett Holzmeyer. But again, just from April 1st and watching what Boston did throughout 2024, how else could you choose an MVP other than Jeff Babbitt, to me, personally?
Yeah, I agree. And I think like just last thing I even want to put out there, you mentioned like the lack of errors. He had 4 total turnovers in his 14 games played, and while he's not somebody who's pushing the disc down the field with his throws a lot, he had you look at the top 10 like in plus minus, he had the third most throws out of any of those players. Like he had more throws than a guy like Garrett Martin, who we think of as a guy who can do things with the disc in his hands. The only players ahead of him were like guys like Travis Dunn and Alan Laviolette, who are, more people who have the disc in their hands all the time due to just the roles of the team. They're shooters, they're center handlers, they're people who are literally getting the disc thrown to them for, centered to them on a regular basis. So like it is crazy to have, like you said, 261 throws, only 3 throwaways the entire season. Because the one thing he did really well this year that it was a little different from his role in New York was just being that constant pressure release, because Boston's offense would get stuck a lot. But when it would get stuck, he would just come into the backfield, get the disc, move it, and he was always there to do that whenever they needed it, because he can just kind of get open at will, it seems like. So well deserved, Jeff. I mean, it's very different than his MVP season from last year. We're looking at him as an MVP for like different reasons, but yeah, the elevation of that franchise, which really starts with him coming over, the people that joined with him, and then just the complete attitude and like approach shift that you could see with Boston was phenomenal.
And I've got to say it because it's just continued to crop up in my mind. It reminds me so much of how Bo Kittredge finished his seasons in with the Spiders and the Empire, where somebody who's been kind of maligned for a lack of throwing depth or creativity or power or something. But you go back and you look at Bo's career, he's like a 95% plus career thrower. Mm-hmm. They trusted him, especially the Empire towards the later stages of his career. He did the same sort of thing. He'd come into the backfield, he'd be a pressure release valve, he'd get a reset to somebody else, and then he would clear out. It's not super sexy work, but it does work, right? And that's something that Babbitt has been so comfortable in his offensive role, is just facilitating that Boston offense. And you could just see how, despite maybe the lack of scoring output, the way in which it just solidified everything. And so to your point, hats off to Babbitt, second straight MVP. He becomes the first player since Goose Helton in 2020, 12, and 2013 to win back-to-back MVPs for different franchises. Goose did it with your Indianapolis AlleyCats in 2012, and then with the Chicago, then Wildfire in 2013, and now Babbitt with New York and Boston in 2023 and 2024. Let's continue to move on. We've got so much else to get to in this episode. Next up, Defensive Player of the Year, unanimous selection. No one was doubting this one. It's Lucas Ambrose. He's got 12 more blocks than anyone else in the entire league. He closed the season on a heater, unlike I've really seen from a defensive player individually in this league. I mean, you go back through the last, 4 or 5 games that he had probably 3+ standout plays in every single matchup that he started in. You saw it in 2023 in his rookie season when he won Rookie of the Year and was runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year in LA. He's just a fire starter of a different caliber that I don't think this league has ever seen.
Yeah, and I gotta say, being able to watch him in person at championship weekend for the first time, like, he's a player that looks even more explosive when you see him in person than what you see on film. And I think that's true with most people, but like, I think for me, it just really stood out with him. You see the highlight plays, you know the explosiveness is there, but when you're witnessing it, from 30, 40 feet away versus on your screen, it really is a sight to behold. And, he's, I think, a big, rising tide raises all ships type of thing. Like, he comes to Seattle, he's able to obviously take like whatever matchup you want to put him on and generate blocks. And if you look at the block numbers from some other individuals on Seattle, there are multiple players there's like 3 players that are at or above 20 blocks, or like in that neighborhood, which is pretty insane. But it's really all generated a lot from him. Like, he's able to fly around to make so many plays, and in a lot of cases take the top matchup, and that allows these other really capable defenders to go on a different matchup, a slightly easier matchup, and kind of wreak havoc there. And we had this question coming into the season: what is Seattle's defense going to be like? We thought that might be an area of weakness for them, and they were really able to turn it into something that, while it definitely had its gaps and its holes, it wasn't something that was just a straight up weakness for them. In fact, they had games where they really put the clamps on certain teams. And Ambrose is clearly like the guy who was the start of all that. I mean, I think the very first game of the season against San Diego, he had like 5 or 6 blocks, like right off the bat, like first game. And that type of intensity he brings, the athleticism and the playmaking, it's it's been on full display for the last 2 years. Like everyone else is just a step or two behind where he's at when it comes to generating blocks.
A step or two behind is such a good way to put how Ambrose approaches basically every single individual matchup, right? Like, we've been talking about just kind of his coverage abilities, his ability to be like your CB1, your shutdown island. You throw him on the other team's number one option and he can go get blocks. That is such a difference maker in this league, to be able to have a defender of that caliber and to have everyone else skew out from that, as you were talking about a moment ago. The ability for a Mikey O'Brien, a Jasper Dean to get up into the league leader in blocks categories is because they can shift down a matchup and have Ambrose take the Travis Dunn, the Jordan Kerr, the Alex Atkins / Quinn Finer matchup in whatever opponent that they have. But the other thing, and that we haven't really discussed, Ambrose on the counterattack, man.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he had 45 total scores, 19 assists, 26 goals. He completed almost 94% of his throws. He had almost 3,000 yards from scrimmage. You know, you compare that to Jeff Babbitt, who again was second in the league in takeaways. Babbitt got a lot of that from playing on offense. He played almost 75% of his points on offense. That's almost the inverse for Ambrose. He played 75% of his points on defense and finished with just 5 fewer scores than the actual MVP. You know, I know he played a few more points. He played the same number of games. Like, it just speaks to how much of a spark plug Ambrose is, regardless of where the disc is on the field. It doesn't matter if his team is in possession of it or if his opponent is in possession of it. He's either getting it or scoring it. Like, to me, I feel like it's so good that these two players are finishing in the top 2 in MVP results, because it's so indicative of their impact. I know it doesn't speak to the throwing dimension that we always want to enshrine in this league, but it speaks to how they can just go and get the damn disc.
Yeah, I was talking with Brian Jones at Championship Week, and you mentioned like the throwing dimension, and I was just curious. Brian Jones has done a lot of coaching in his life. He's coached, he's won club nationals. He was the coach of the 2019 Empire that went undefeated. And picking his brain, I was like, what's the most valuable skill in Frisbee? Like, what do you think? And his answer was getting open. Getting open is the most valuable skill. Like, and you have Jeff Babbitt as the MVP, who can probably get open with any cut he wants to make at any time. And you have Lucas Ambrose, who can also do that, like with his speed and athleticism, but he's also the guy who can get blocks on the guys who can get open. Like, you kind of have this inverse relationship there, right? And vice versa, right? You look at both of them, they both can take your number one option when they're on defense, and they both can be the number one option on offense. So I think it kind of speaks to like, what is Frisbee like ultimately about? Like, getting open, getting the disc, and eventually getting open in the end zone and catching it, right? Like that's how you win the game. I tell this to kids I've coached. It doesn't matter how good of a thrower you are if you don't have anyone open to throw to. But quite the opposite. You can be a kind of a bad thrower, but if you have players who can get really open, then you don't have to be a great thrower. So we have two guys here who the throwing dimension is definitely not what they're known for. It's very low on the list of things that you would go on about, like the things that they're supremely talented at. They're both capable. They both can be good with the disc in their hands, but ultimately they're great at getting open and great at keeping other people from getting open.
Great at keeping other people from open just reminds me of kind of the block. I mean, he was already my pick basically going into the playoffs, but Ambrose's underneath block on Anders Jungst in the second semifinal, when Seattle was playing Carolina. I mean, the broadcast was raving about it. Brian Jones, Charlie Eisenhood, Evan Lepler, they were all going on about, I don't know if I've ever seen somebody get an underneath block on Anders Jungst, and Ambrose is just coming over his shoulder, absolutely zero physicality, to just get this acrobatic takeaway. It's one of those things, and he does it maybe once or twice a game where it's like nobody else makes that play. No one else in this entire league does something like what Ambrose just did. And I really want to see him stick around in Seattle for another year because I'd love to see what a Cascades team with this much athleticism can do with a little bit more consistency in their scheme and in their rotations. So we'll see if the Defensive Player of the Year in 2024 comes back to the Cascades in 2025. Rounding out the rest of the finalists for Defensive Player of the Year, Henry Fisher finishes as first round runner-up. Lucas McClamrock from Atlanta, despite starting in only 9 games and having the tail end of his season sort of sidetracked due to injury, finishes as a second runner-up. And honestly, I gotta say, that's super deserving for him. I felt like when he was playing, given how he was also guarding on Jungst in a fantastic way and really inserting himself in the counterattack, he felt like one of the most impactful defenders in the entire league. But we got to continue to move on. We've got Rookie of the Year up next. We've got another unanimous winner. No surprise here if you've been following along through the 2024 UFA season. Tobe DeCrane from Montreal Royale sweeping the Rookie of the Year award. He was just, I mean, we talked about it after the first weekend to play when the Royale went and faced Boston and then New York on a road trip doubleheader. DeCrane was just the best player on the field in both of those games, despite Montreal dropping them. He was laying out and then running out and getting the goal off of his own reset and getting layout blocks and finishing with like 5+ assists in both games. I think for the weekend, he finished with almost 20 total scores in his debut. This is a 20-year-old from Belgium, right? Like, this is somebody who I know has a fantastic amount of talent, has succeeded on the international circuit, but to just come in and start absolutely wrecking people, I mean, he announced it on week 1, and then he just continued it throughout the entire season. He was a league leader almost in blocks and assists in his first professional season.
Yeah, and he, at the beginning of the year, we didn't know really what to make of this Boston team, right? So, like, we didn't know exactly how good they were going to be. We figured pretty good. This Montreal Royale almost beat them 3 times. Like, the first game of the season, they were right there. I think they got to within 1 with just a couple minutes left on the road in Boston, first game of the season. They have a game at home where they really, probably for all intents and purposes, it was one of those games where you're like, how did you end up losing that game? They had the lead at the end of the game. And then the second time they played them at home, they did beat them. They had a game against DC at the end of the game where they just couldn't quite hold on and almost beat them. They had a game against New York. They almost won. And this is a team, much like we talk about Babbitt going to Boston and changing the culture, and we talk about Lucas Ambrose going to Seattle and all. It wasn't just him, right? But clearly he had a huge impact on the turnaround they had in Seattle this year. I mean, adding Tobe DeCrane to this team, which had 0 wins last year, and really just at certain points during the season last year, I felt like you kind of just wondered where do they generate offense from? It felt like they were on such a struggle to just get things going. And you bring him in, he's the spark plug immediately. I think the play in that first weekend that I still talk about to people when I talk about the play that really, where I was like, oh my gosh, this guy is just he's going to set the league on fire this year. He lays out for I think a scuba reset that was kind of poorly thrown.
Trash.
Catches it just an inch off the ground, stands up and immediately rips a flick huck around a mark on a dime, 50, 60 yards downfield for a score. And I was just like, holy crap. That is a play. And at the time, this was during their kind of comeback where it looked like they might come back and take the lead. And it was just to make that type of play and that type of moment in his first game ever, supremely impressive. So, this was an easy one for me when it was Rookie of the Year voting, put him at the top of the ballot. And certainly there were some other great rookies this year, but he was head and shoulders above everyone else. And just not only what he was able to do, but just the impact he had on winning, I think, for his team compared to where they were the year before.
So Elliot Benet and Aaron Wolf finish as the first and second runner-ups, respectively, for the Rookie of the Year award. But I do want to take another moment to talk about DeCrane because I totally agree with you. It was like a culture shift with the way in which he could make highlight plays. In fact, it reminded me a little bit of Ambrose, the 2023 Rookie of the Year award winner in unanimous fashion, where it was just you don't see this stuff. Like, there are these younger players coming into the league at this point where they have, I don't know if it's a brand or a swagger or an attitude. I don't know what it is, but they're doing things in ways in which you just don't see other people performing in that way. And to your point, that was the same play that I thought, man, this DeCrane cat is real in week 1 when he, picked a disc full extension off of the turf and then with zero hesitation just fired an absolute bullseye into the end zone. I think it was to like Quentin Bonat or somebody streaking in a corner. It was like a fade route almost. The no hesitation, the ability to come into the league and know you can succeed is such a recent phenomenon in the last like 4+ ish seasons where we just have rookie class after rookie class. And we'll get into this later when we talk about the rookie teams, where it's like, how do you even really gauge how much talent is here? Because again, like DeCrane is changing the scope of how Montreal performs. Bonet enters onto a DC team that dropped Christian Boxley, an All-UFA member in 2023 due to his Worlds participation in 2024, which RIP, he was injured and couldn't really be on the field for their gold medal competitions. But Bonet steps into that goal scoring role on DC, and the Breeze have their most successful season in franchise history. Aaron Wolf on Seattle, almost ditto. I know that Seattle made a championship game appearance in 2016, but honestly, it feels like in certain ways the 2024 Cascades sort of leapfrogged I think, expectations of what happened in 2016. Like the way in which Seattle won this year felt more significant than sort of the blue flamer burst that Seattle got in 2016. And Wolf felt absolutely integral to that sort of success. You talk about top level O-line defenders off of a turn. I've got Jacob Fairfax. I've got Jeff Babbitt. I've got Aaron Wolf. Like, he's in that kind of territory. So I really think it speaks to the kind of caliber that DeCrane played in to receive this unanimous vote, right? Like, every single year we've got this just crop of new players who are fantastic. And DeCrane was just head and shoulders better, like throughout the season. Just had a different way about him.
Yeah, dude's real good. I hope he sticks around. I know, obviously, all 3 of the players, by the way, rookie of the year, international players. Like, so I know from talking in some of my conversations, some of these players may or may not be back next year. It's kind of up in the air, as you would expect, since they don't live in these areas full time. But I mean, so excited. Like, I really hope all the 3 of these guys find a way back into the league next year, because yeah, they all were able to accomplish things with these teams this year that maybe felt out of reach or definitely felt different the year before. Like, it was really hard. Like the impact was so obvious with DeCrane, where like with Bonet, it was like a little bit more nebulous because he was coming into kind of this ready-made situation. Like, DC's been so good and so competitive for so long that it's like, where does his impact start and like the impact of like the team that was already there end? It's kind of hard to tell. Clearly he was able to make some fantastic plays and kind of just like fit right in. It almost looked like he'd been a part of that offense for seasons, not just like joining this year. But like the impacts of like an Aaron Wolf and a DeCrane were, I think, just so much more tangible, because you saw like such big leaps from where those teams were the year before, where DC Breeze made like a little bunny hop compared to like maybe where they were in years past.
Yeah, but don't undercredit that kind of seamless transition. I feel like you know that as well from your experiences in Indianapolis, where you have that ready-made system and you lose somebody and then you bring on this new part and you're kind of curious as to how it fits. And then it's like, oh, they just slot right in. And that's how I felt about Bonet. It was just such a clear fit for both parties, where it was the player was absolutely specialized for the role that DC needed.
Yeah, and he was there were some games in particular this year where it was like he was special, like very special. And I think you could say that about all 3 of these. But DeCrane, yeah, he was just on another level with the impact that he was able to bring this year.
I mean, DeCrane, in all honesty, has the kind of potential to be like the best player in the world should he choose to kind of accept that as a trial. But let's continue to move on. We got Coach of the Year next. Winner, no surprise here. It's usually the team that wins the UFA title. Minnesota head coach Ben Feldman, followed by Lauren Boyle of DC Breeze and Jesse Bolton of the Seattle Cascades as the first and second runners up, respectively. One of the things I was talking about with another person voting on the ballot, Ian Toner, the Colorado and Game of the Week broadcaster, very familiar if you listen to any sort of ultimate Frisbee action within the sport. Coach of the Year is one of those awards where obviously the head signal caller kind of gets the most notable flowers, but this is a system award. This is something that I think extends to the entire coaching staffs. And so I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Max Longchamp and Carlos Lopez of Minnesota, because I know they were integral to Feldman's sort of structuring of that entire system. But given how Minnesota finished the season, given how they came out head and shoulders above the rest of the Central Division fray, it felt like Feldman was the most fingers on the pulse, knew exactly what lineups to pull, knew what strategies to implement better than anyone else this season. All the credit to Boyle for taking over from Daryl Stanley, one of the most established and congratulated and awarded coaches in this sport's history in DC. She did a fantastic job of building off of what Stanley had set as the framework and then evolving that. Jesse Bolton, similarly to what I was talking about a few moments ago about Seattle probably having its most, I think, notably successful season in franchise history. He deserves a ton of credit there, along with Kelly Johnson and the rest of that Seattle coaching staff. But for me, it just kind of comes back to, again, for coaching in the sport, it comes down to knowing your lineups, knowing your rotations, and knowing when to play them best. And Feldman and the Minnesota staff did that better than anybody by a visible margin.
Yeah, I mean, these were the three coaches I had on my ballot. And the hardest part for me was figuring out what order to put them in. I think I've been very spoiled by just knowing, like, having so many interactions with Ben and, like, talking to Minnesota Wind-Chill players about the impact he's had. And so I've known I feel like he could have been coach of the year in a lot of other years, but you're right. It usually does go like a lot of times it does go to a coach who either wins the title or, in the case of someone like Jesse Bolton, it's like a huge turnaround from where a team was previously. All three very deserving, but yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense to give it to the guy who just wanted, was the coach of the title winning team, has for a long time been respected, especially within the division, of just like the tactics that are brought to the game and just like the commitment level that he kind of commands from his players. Like he really demands a lot out of these players. He demands a lot out of them following like what the game plan is and making sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. You're right, Max Longchamp, Carlos Lopez, like definitely deserve some shout outs too, because I know it's not a one person effort when it comes to this, but they've had a lot of great coaching going on in Minnesota for several seasons now, and it's one of the reasons that they've gotten to the point they're at, where they've really kind of taken a chokehold on the Central Division over the last couple of years and have been, the most successful team in the Central since the COVID shutdown. After a couple of years of Chicago going championship weekend in Minnesota, finishing runner up, they've been the class of the Central, and they're the first team in the Central to win the title since 2018. So, in fact, I think those are the only two teams in the Central that have won the title.
Yeah, I mean, Minnesota and Madison have brought any kind of notoriety to the Central Division, because I feel like it's one of the more maligned regions, as I'm sure you're familiar with, in this league. I think we do kind of take a lot of pot shots at the Central and the West for various reasons, and I think it's a real credit to Feldman that they entered that bracket as the 4 seed, or excuse me, they were lower seeded. No, wait, they were the 4 seed.
They were the 4 seed, yeah.
They were the 4 seed championship weekend in 2024, and they came out beating ostensibly the two most talented teams in DC and Carolina. Like, to me, that speaks to coaching. To me, how they sort of cleared all their biggest hurdles speaks to coaching. I know what you mentioned earlier on the show, that when they entered the playoffs, there was sort of those losses to Chicago and New York in particular that left us with some questions. There was the home opener loss to Pittsburgh, which I think really upended some of our notions as to what Minnesota's ceiling might be. But they took all of those losses as lessons and they flipped them around into understanding what their lineups and rotations are better than any other team in this league. And that's ultimately what it comes down to, especially in a season like this. I feel like in past seasons, it's been New York constructing their most talented lineups on top of kind of whatever anyone else does. This year, it really felt so wide open that it was up for a team like Minnesota to seize the opportunity and really come away with the championships. And so hats off to Ben Feldman and the Minnesota coaching staff for their Coach of the Year accolades. The final individual award that we're getting to on this episode before we break into the team awards is Most Improved Player. And for all of the difficulties and other votings, I feel like Most Improved Player has become the real sort of hot spot when discussing our ballots. This year, Gordon Larson, Minnesota Wind Chill, very deserved winner. Mitchell McCarthy and Spencer Loafing from Madison and Seattle, respectively, getting runner-up nods. But, I mean, there's like 10 other players I could have submitted to this and probably constructed a pretty good argument around. We'll get to Larson in a second, but, Wilson Matthews, I think, had 6 combined career goals before this season, finishes with 45 and leads Chicago. You look at a player, around the league, like even Simon Carapella on Boston goes from being kind of their 1A wide receiving option to being this completely well-rounded individual who functions perfectly off of Jeff Babbitt in 2024. I was just kind of interested as to how you approached this award, because I think it's one of those ones where, again, Larson is totally deserving. It felt like he emerged as almost a star-level performer for Minnesota, but there are 10 other guys who feel like you could easily qualify for this nomination.
Yeah, it was, I think when it came down to me was, because this was probably, out of the individual awards, the hardest for me to decide who was at the top. Like the rest of them, I felt pretty good pretty early about who was at the top, and I didn't really shake from that. This one was really, for me, it came down to me between Gordon Larson and Mitchell McCarthy. And the reason those two people really were it for me was because I wanted to look at, obviously, somebody who showed like a drastic improvement in terms of their play, but also how much did it impact the team? Like, I felt like both of those two players, more so than any other player that I was considering, impacted like winning and what the ceiling of that team was. When you look at like Minnesota, they didn't actually win more during the regular season, but when Gordon Larson was there and playing, it was just so clear that he was able to unlock another level to their offense that didn't exist in previous years. And to me, like, being a person that was able to like unlock a new level of the offense for a team that ended up going and winning a championship was what put him over the edge. Mitchell McCarthy was one who came out of absolutely nowhere. If you want to talk about just like raw statistical like jumps in terms of like scores and stuff like that, Mitchell McCarthy wins that battle hands down. But Gordon Larson was doing it for a team that was winning a division, ultimately winning a title, and that was kind of what put him like just slightly over the edge for me. But Mitchell McCarthy, man, go look at what that dude did before this year, and then this was a guy who wasn't even getting to play in most games, let alone have much of an impact in them. And then he played
one game in 2023.
Yeah, like he just couldn't even get on the field, and then he's putting up the types of numbers he's putting up this year. It's very impressive turnaround.
Miles Grovic for DC is another player like that. He played 1 or 2 games in his rookie year last year, and then this year emerged as one of their best, it felt like, defensive one-on-one players, especially in the counterattack. I also agree with McCarthy, man, having called all of the Madison home games and just watched his impact for that D-line. I mean, He completed almost 80% of his huck attempts as a D-line thrower and was one of the bigger volume hucking throwers in the 2024 season. That sort of counterattacking specialization is just not found on other teams. And his ability to get blocks on like the mark and in lane spaces, he's not getting blocks downfield in some, cherry picker role. He's getting it sort of in the interstitial spaces. That is just so impressive to me. But yeah, to your points about Larson, to me, it came down to the smoothness and almost what Bryce Merrill said in one of the pregame shows at Championship Weekend. I was not familiar with your game. I did not know that your two previous seasons on Minnesota that you had this sort of ceiling to you. What he showed from us in the Week 12 matchup against New York when he was dominating that first half and keeping Minnesota close throughout the opening two quarters. His ability to spell at times on D-line, to be able to be a part of this sort of interchangeability that Minnesota really mastered towards the end of their season. You talk about a Larson, Brian Vanuka being able to sort of contribute a few points here or there onto a D-line rotation. Like, that stuff is invaluable. So that's what it came down to for me for Larson, was just not only the production numbers, not only being the second leading scorer on the championship team, but his ability to fill in whatever role they needed and being able to be kind of a star in that given assignment.
Yeah. And, no offense to anyone else that was up for grabs in this award, but I thought those two guys were just like head and shoulders, like in terms of the amount of improvement. You're right. There are lots of players I think you could consider like to put on your ballot, but I thought those two just made such drastic jumps from where they were before in years past, and were so responsible for raising the ceiling of the team that they were on. And we saw it with Mitchell McCarthy, like it was making the playoffs for the first time since before COVID shut down, and for a Madison Radicals team. So, and then with Gordon Larson, it was taking a team who had been, was on the cusp of making the championship game last year, and then pushing them over the edge, not to just get to that championship game, but ultimately win it. So, I also was not familiar with his game, so I echo Bryce Merrill's comment.
I'll put in another word for Spencer Lofink too, because I think that we saw all the playmaking potential for the Cascades for the longest time. Even last year, they were a playmaking team. They were a highlight-ready team. Lofink, in his ability to be that pivot handler in the center of the field and just distribute, do the little chisel throws, break the mark, reset the disc, get it to where it needs to go, be a really reliable contributor in the red zone, which is, I think, a really understated part of the Cascades' successes in 2024. Like, to me, he definitely deserves to be a finalist because of all that, because it's so much of the grunt work, it's so much of the in the trenches stuff. Like, I know he had fantastic production numbers as a result of what Seattle did, but his specific contributions were not necessarily a part of what was the highlight headliner successes for that team, and I think that deserves its own kind of accreditation, and I'm glad to see him on this finalist list. But
yeah,
we've now got 7 teams
game
worth of content to get through, so we've got a blitz, man. We've got first team, second team, third team All-UFA, 2 teams all defense, 2 teams rookie. So let's get to work. First team All-UFA. We're going to read this one front to back because it's absolutely worth it. The top 7 players from the 2024 season. The 2 players receiving unanimous ballot cast for first team were the 2 first place finishers in MVP voting, Jeff Babbitt and Lucas Ambrose, getting absolutely unanimous selections to the most prestigious team in the Ultimate Frisbee Association. Joining him is also Alex Atkins of the Colorado Summit, Brett Hulsmeyer, the Atlanta Hustle, Anders Jungs and Alan Laviolette of the Carolina Flyers, and Jack Williams of the New York Empire, rounding out the top 7 from the league. I know you had one player you wanted to talk about, We discussed Babbitt and Ambrose already, so we're going to kind of scooch them to the side. But you've got somebody in your mind that you wanted to highlight from this first team selection.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's Alex Atkins. I mean, this Colorado Summit team, we had high expectations for what they possibly could accomplish. And, then kind of a shock to all of us, they didn't even end up making the playoffs. And a lot of that had to do with roster consistency issues, but that was not due to lack of trying by Alex Atkins, because that dude, I mean, I think you saw like, if you wanted to pick a time when it was like most fully on display, it was their trip to the Central Division where they were at Madison Friday night and at Minnesota Saturday night. You just saw him really, like, at times putting the team on his back. Like, he in that Madison game played something ridiculous, like 37 points or something like that. I think on that weekend, he put up like 1,700 yards in those two games. I mean, it was just disgusting video game numbers. And there are lots of players throughout the league that put up numbers that seem kind of meaningless. Like the numbers might be, famously, I go back to when Joe Cubit set the single season record or single game record for most throwing yards, where we blew them out in Indy, but he was starting off every possession by throwing like a 25-yard centering pass. And because they were getting blown out, they were receiving lots of pulls. So it was like a lot of artificial like number inflation. That is not the case with like Alex Atkins. Like all of his yards are like him just churning and the offense just running through him at all points. I think he's also a guy who, like, he does put up the highlight plays on top of just like consistently showing up and being such a presence on the field. So he's the only person who didn't make the playoffs who is on the first team. But I think that just kind of shows the impact that he had, that he still made the first team, despite not having the team success that the rest of the players on this list
had. But we got to continue to move on. Second team, just going to run right through it. Tobe DeCrane, Montreal Royale, Travis Dunce, San Diego Growlers, Anthony Gutowski, Madison Radicals, Cole Jurek, DC Breeze, Garrett Martin, Seattle Cascades, Austin Taylor, Atlanta Hustle, and Brian Vanuka, Minnesota Windchill. DeCrane, Gutowski, Jurek, and Vanuka all receiving their first All-UFA nods. So hats off to those four players. Cam, who is your player that you kind of want to highlight from the second team?
Travis Dunn, man. Just like
dog.
Does it every year. Like he just shows up every year. Doesn't matter about like the team success. When they were going to championship weekend every year, he's doing it. When they're rebuilding, he's doing it. Like this year, I think that they were secretly, like, if you didn't watch their games, you wouldn't realize like how close they might be to actually being like a playoff team. They especially, like, they start off the season getting crushed in Seattle, and then they kind of rebounded after that, and they actually put together a pretty nice season where they were really competitive in a lot of games and just couldn't quite close some of them out in order to make the playoffs. But I mean, this is a team that's building, and it has a lot of young pieces that it feels like could be really coming into their own next season. I wouldn't be surprised if they are right there in the thick of the playoff hunt next year. And if that happens, you know who's going to be at the center of it? Travis Dunn. Because Travis Dunn's just going to show up, and he's going to be as steady as they come with the disc in his hands. He's going to be a playmaker downfield in the cutting space. And he's just been doing this year in and year out. At this point, it's just like, it's old hat to him. Like, he just kind of lives in this like all UFA space. Like he is, in terms of just the production he's able to put up every year with this level of consistency, there's just not a lot of other players you can really point to that have been able to do it as consistently for as long as he's done it. And it continues to be super impressive. And I think it would have been really easy for people to forget about him and leave him off this list this year, especially because he does it all the time. It almost feels boring at this point, but he's just so damn good.
He was fourth in the league in total scores. He had 50 plus assists again. He had 6,400 total yards of offense, including 3,645 in receiving yards. To your point, I know San Diego didn't finish in the playoff contention for the second straight season, but Travis Dunn has made an all-UFA roster every single season since 2018. He is literally one of the most perennially consistent performers in the entire UFA. And this year, honestly, just from watching him, was probably one of the most impressive from like a highlight perspective. And he's, again, in a part of his career where you're supposed to be waning, and it feels like he's only heating up. I'm going to compliment and dovetail your kind of old head veteran pick from this second team, and I want to talk about Brian Vanuka. You know, I personally voted for him for a championship weekend MVP. I felt like that was a career accolade he absolutely deserved. But more importantly, I'm just so glad that guy got a trophy. Like, you talk about hard workers, you talk about people who put in stuff off the field. There's nobody who's more consistent than Brian Vanuka. And I feel like 2024 was really the crowning achievement of his career in this league, where he played almost 50-50 offensive and defensive points split. Like I was talking before about how Gordon Larson was so able to be versatile and sort of deployed into roles in which the coaching staff needed him. That's archetyped off of Bevon. That's because they have a player like Bevon who they all go, hey, our best player can just go do whatever we want him to. If we need him to be our A1 cutter, he'll go do that. If we need him to clear out and go be our best defender on the opposing team's top matchup, he can go do that. And because he's so unrelentingly, unhesitatingly willing to accept those challenges, everyone else on the roster does. And I feel like you've just seen that over the last couple of seasons with Minnesota. They used to have a little bit more of structure between their O-line and D-line. And yet, as the years have progressed, it's felt like they've become more and more loose in how they associate those roles. And I just feel like it all stems down from how Vanuka has performed for this team. I mean, even his throwing capacity, that used to be kind of the big question mark, was how can he be a reliable thrower in the continuation game? And I just feel like every year he gets a little bit better at discerning what his call shots are, at what his opportunities are to put that go gadget flick out or reset and just get the disc moving. Like, his ability to continue to add to his game as he works into his 30s similarly is done, and yet have no depreciation of their highlight potential or their kind of impact factor, is just why I felt like Vanuka almost deserved a first team nod this year, especially on a Minnesota team that had so many other kind of ebbs and flows as far as who they were putting in where and in what role. It was like Bevon was similarly slippery as far as where you could identify him on any given lineup, and yet his production was unquestionable. I mean, you look at, again, somebody with almost a 50-50 point split between offensive and defensive lines, and there's no one who really comes within a kind of deviation of the kind of production that he put up in 2024.
Yeah. He's been great for them for a long time in different capacities, but he's really taken it to another level recently. And I think the biggest thing the last 2 years, he has been lights out in the playoffs. Like, he was...
Well, he used to not be.
Yeah. The last 2 years, though, he's been incredible. He was the best player in that Salt Lake game last year. I think he was the best player on the field for either team. And I'm right there with you. He would have been my championship weekend MVP had I had a vote or had a say in it. And I think you just look at some of the plays he made, and especially in that DC game, like the kind of game-sealing play for them where he goes up and grabs a disc near the sideline that he really had like no business coming down with, which led to a score 2 throws later. He had numerous like big plays in the championship game, and he epitomizes like what it looks like when you continue to work hard and grow as a player like throughout your entire career, and don't just like fall off a cliff because you've hit your 30s. I mean, he's only a year younger than I am. He'll be 35 this fall, in this November, and you know, he's playing as well now as he ever has. Like, he kind of feels like one of those guys that could kind of just keep this going as long as he wants to and as long as he's interested. one absolutely deserve this too to make an all UFA team this year. Like absolutely well deserved. Um, couldn't have happened to like a nicer guy, a harder working guy than him. So super happy for Bevon.
I need him to bring back the frosted tips, though. The frosted tips have gone away, and he needs to bring those back for performance purposes. Also, most notably, he caught the game-winning goal in the championship on a front cone cut, which I just feel like Babbitt, Jungst, I feel are the sort of proprietors of the front cone cut right now. Jeff Babbitt and Anders Jungst. Like those are the two sort of prototypical. You need an open cut to the front cone, clear out, let them go do work. Those two kind of have earned that province. Bevon is right up there for me, man. Like if you need somebody to get squirrely and loose and get open on that front cone, it's Bevon, and that's what he did for Minnesota in their championship game win. Let's move on to third team. Third team consists of Will Brandt from Minnesota, Jacob Fairfax and Henry Fisher from Carolina, Ben Yacht from New York Empire, Jeremy Langdon from the Atlanta Hustle, Evan Magsig from the Oakland Spiders, and Alec Wilson Holiday from the Dallas Legion. Wilson Holiday, Magsig and Brandt are making their first appearances on an all UFA roster. Fairfax and Fisher as well. Fisher did not make an all UFA roster in 2019 during his fantastic rookie season. So there are a number of first timers on this third team. You had a particular selection that you wanted to talk about.
Henry Fisher, man. If you would have told me he would be making a all UFA team after his 2019 season, I would 100% would have believed it. I would not have known it was going to be for the reason he made this team, which was his impact as a defender. He just, he was on that O-line for the 2022 team that made the championship weekend and ultimately lost to New York Empire. And he had kind of always been, I think in my eyes, he was an O-line player. He was making his impact by being this huge downfield threat with incredible speed and height. And he was just going to be a matchup nightmare in that way. But we really saw him take his game, I think, to a new level. And I think truly saw where he could be most impactful, which is on the defensive side, again, using that height and speed and athleticism to just completely change what the deep space especially looks like. He, especially when you put him with like Drew Swanson and Matt Tucker, who are also big bodies and no slouches in the air, I just felt like he was able to take them to such a different level defensively. And he had such an impact. And I felt like played with so much more confidence than I'd seen in the past. And he was an absolute matchup nightmare when they got the disc. And he was the one who could get cut deep or even occasionally throw. He also was a really good puller for Carolina this year at times. And it's just, he was able to impact the game in so many different ways than I would have guessed watching him for the first time 5 years ago. And I think his transformation of a player has been really impressive. It reminds me a little bit of like what we saw with Antoine Davis, where he was kind of this offensive force and you kind of thought that was where his impact was always going to be. And then I think just unlocked a new level to their game when they got switched over to the defensive side and had to kind of approach everything from a different perspective and with a different mindset. But he was, I think, the best player at championship weekend in total. Like if you had a situation where a player from a losing team won an MVP award for championship weekend, this is maybe the most standout performance from somebody who didn't win a title at any championship weekend that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I feel like is emerging as a theme in this episode, which is that players who have always been fantastic in a certain way rounding out their game. And that's Henry Fisher, right? Like he made first team all rookie in 2019. He's been this known quantity for a while, right? Like in 2021 when Carolina won their title, it was Fisher and Fairfax on offense kind of being those twin towers that anchored everything so that Mitchell and all the other stuff could operate. Laviolette was fantastic on that team. Also got all UFA second team honors in 2021. But Fisher was such the sort of anchor post of all that. And to see him now expand all of that, right? To use his height not just for getting blocks, but for striding out in pulls, striding out in his huge backhands. You know, he's got one of the most underrated backhand deep throws in the entire league, if not game. He's 6'6". At any time, he is maybe the fastest person on the field. He's just, we talked about in the recap of championship weekend, he's a problem. Capital P, you know, like big fish, when he just gets into that mess, it's just a lot to deal with, man. Like, and to see him again developing those technical skills, developing the kind of sense of timing, not necessarily having to rely on his success being highlight plays deep as a receiver, but being kind of the block that they need at a particular moment. Like, it's just, he's one of those players who I just sit back and I kind of cross my arms and say, man, it's so cool that you're getting to this stage in your career that you can just sort of do things. You can pull, you can go downfield as a receiver. You're a great thrower in deep space, like whatever the team kind of needs. Like Fisher sort of seems able to step up to that. My player to highlight is Will Brandt, the actual championship weekend MVP, who I will discreetly mention, not so discreetly given that's a podcast. I did not put him on any of my All-UFA ballots. I'm speaking to him strictly from respect of what he's sort of meant to this team. And, you know, again, we talk about the manifest ways in which Minnesota has become so versatile. I feel like Brandt is another representative alongside Brian Vanuka as far as that trend goes, where, you know, we laud him for his ability as a backfield thrower. I think his absolute A1 skill is breaking the mark, being able to sort of redistribute from any position on the field and get the disc back to an advantageous position for the wind chill. But he showed a mobility and a composure that I know I've seen from him many times, but given the stakes that they had at championship weekend, it was just so evident that, like, yeah, this is the guy as the motor for this wind chill offense. Like, he walks them down the field. There was that drive, I think, against Carolina in the second half when they got up to midfield, and he literally just ratcheted it every other throw from one side of the field to the other and then punched in a red zone score. Like, it was nothing. And it was one of those possessions, again, in a weekend where nobody made anything look easy, and Brandt's just casually strolling into the end zone with the wind chill offense. And so I think that Brandt's ability to, again, push Minnesota to its highest levels is absolutely deserving of this All-UFA nomination.
I've talked about Will Brandt a lot on this podcast and breaking the mark and what a cheat code he is. I know we're running a little long, so I'll let us go ahead and scoot on to the next section. Will Brandt's awesome. Marking him is stupid and hard, and he's real good.
I'll never forget when they were playing Colorado in that Super Series game in Week 8, and Colorado was throwing 6'5" Kai Marshall on him. I think they threw Sandy Brown on him. They were just throwing length on Brandt, trying to get any sort of solution for his ability to just stride out and break it. And he just, every single time, was just like, all right, I'll take it, and then just shredding them, just like cheddar.
Didn't
matter. All right, moving on. First team all defense. Unanimous selection, the only one on either team, Lucas Ambrose. Again, he was the unanimous selection for Defensive Player of the Year, so no surprise there. Joining him, Henry Fisher, the runner-up, Lucas McClamrock, the second runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year, also on first team all-defense. Joining those three as well as Sterling Kanaki of Madison, Cameron Lacey of Minnesota, Jake Reuben Miller of Chicago, and Chad Jorgensen of Salt Lake.
Yeah, Cameron Lacey is the one that sticks out to me here. He just, because with him, it's less about the defensive pressure he's able to generate, although he is a very capable and definitely above average defender. It's the pulls, man. Like, he is starting, you are starting off in such a good position defensively because he's the best puller in the league. And he's able to just put opposing offenses in such disadvantageous positions to begin with that it just sets your whole defense up for success. And I'm pretty sure if you asked every single person who voted for Cameron Lacey on this team, they would all say the same thing, that that's like the first thing that comes to mind with him as a defender. And one of the things I think that we never really touched on too much this year is Sam Berglund was really the person who was like their main puller last year, and Cam Lacey was like the other guy who also could do it. And Berglund was out most of the season with an injury and didn't play in the championship game either. And Cameron Lacey like stepped right in and just became this monster. Like the other thing, people don't know this about him, he didn't really start playing any sort of competitive ultimate essentially until playing Windchill last year. Like he is still so young and so raw and has so much to learn that I can't even imagine like what this guy's ceiling is, because he's basically still brand new to competitive Frisbee, and he's made such a huge impact to the point to where he was put, as one of the top 7 players for a defensive team, which is just extremely impressive.
Pinning the backline pull, second total year in Ultimate Frisbee. Like, he's got such an upside, man. To think that, like, he's learning these skills as somebody from a perspective outside of the sport, essentially, to being able to nail one of the hardest technical aspects, which is pulling, in his first 2 seasons. Like, yeah, the sky's the limit for Cameron Lacey. My first team all defense, just sort of highlight, is Sterling Kanaki from the Madison Radicals. He came into this league as one of the best block getters. Kanaki Island was something in his rookie season in 2017, and in 2018 he was fantastic for the Madison team that won the championship. But I felt like he's somebody who's gotten a little bit out of the limelight, and deservedly so, as Madison has not been in playoff contention since they won that title in 2018 until they returned in 2024. But man, Kanaki, it just felt like he was back in that hunter mode, where if there's a disc that he can go get and make a play on, he's going to do it. And obviously, most emphatically, he did it in overtime against Chicago in the first round of the playoffs at home. There's a torrential downpour. He gets a sky block on a reset pass and just sort of triggers the rest of the Radicals' miraculous finish. And it just, again, on a team that is so historically renowned for defense, it felt like Kanaki was sort of the spiritual leader of the Radicals' resurgence in 2024. But we've got to keep moving on. There's second team all defense. I'm just going to run through it real quick. We're not going to discuss it because we've just been going too long in this podcast and we got too much to go through ahead of this. But second team all defense, Nate Astrom from Chicago, David Bloodgood from DC, Justin Burnett from Atlanta, Antoine Davis from New York, Brandon Mattis from Minnesota, Mitchell McCarthy from Madison, and Jasper Tom from DC, rounding out the top 14 defenders from 2024. Going into the all-rookie team, Nate Astrom from the Chicago Union, Christian Bayless from Carolina, Elliot Benet, a unanimous selection for all-rookie first team from DC, Tobe DeCrane, also a unanimous first selection, Pierre Robert from Madison, also a unanimous first team all-rookie selection, Leo Sorvel Fernandez from Minnesota, and Aaron Wolf from Seattle, rounding out the entire first team. Cam, who is a player that you want to highlight from this all-rookie selection?
I mean, where do you start? These are fantastic players. I mean, I think I'm going to go with Leo Sorvel Fernandez. I think, like, this dude, and I think it's because he's another guy kind of like Gordon Larson. Like, Gordon Larson, for all intents and purposes, for me, I know he wasn't a rookie, but he kind of felt like one because, as we mentioned earlier, he kind of like came out of nowhere for us and like had this huge impact that maybe we didn't really expect. And Leo Sorvel Fernandez is kind of the opposite, where like I had heard all this hype coming into the season from talking with Brandon Mattis. He's like, oh, this guy's going to like really, really help us. And I just thought that the impact he was able to have as a rookie, playing so many points on this O-line especially, was just really impressive. Anytime you're able to be a rookie and come in and play like significant points for a team that wins a title in any sport, like that's really impressive. And I thought though that he just kind of seamlessly fit in. You know, they had the loss of Abe Coffin, which we had a lot of questions about in the preseason. Like, what's this going to do to Minnesota's offense? And Sovel Fernandez does not play the exact same way that Coffin does by any means. But one thing that I think he did that was great for them was just like kind of being that person who could make good decisions with the disc and be a distributor, and was maybe a little more willing to go make plays with his legs. But I was just really impressed with the role he was able to kind of step into. You know, he was fourth on the team in completions, again, like as a rookie, to be trusted to have the disc in your hands that much is really impressive, and doing it at a 96% clip too, like having to adapt to new rules and different styles of defense and all these different things. Like, I don't think you can say enough about how he was able to impact this team just so immediately.
Yeah, he was fantastic for them, and I felt like he, along with Larson, was such a calm down force. It felt like whenever they got the disc around or to Sovel Fernandez, it was sort of like everything else just fell into sync. You know, whether he was downfield as a receiver, whether he was distributing, he was just such a positive force for what Minnesota was trying to do. Similarly, for my pick, it's back to Elliot Bonet for DC Breeze. He was just such a positive influence for what the DC offense wants to do. And I feel like it's one of those things where it feels like the Breeze are such an easy opportunity to step into, yet they have such finely tuned machinations and the ways in which they expect you to understand small spaces so well. It's not necessarily a kind of system where you just step in and produce. And yet that's exactly what Benet did. He was one of the most impressive players for them in his professional debut on the road at Salt Lake against the reigning West Division champions and the league runner-up in week 1 of the season. And it felt like he never really slowed down from there. You know, he had a little bit of a disappointing semifinal game, but who on the Breeze didn't against Minnesota in those kinds of wins and conditions? But every other game in which they needed him to step up, it felt like he did. You know, he caught the game winner in double overtime against Philadelphia in week 4. He was massive in their week 10 win against Carolina, who was the runner-up overall in 2024. Like, it just felt whenever they needed Bonet to win his one-on-one matchup, he would go do it. And his ability, again, to sort of step into a Christian Boxley-like role and not see much of a depreciation in that receiving capacity speaks volumes to his future, not only in this league, but in the sport in general.
Yeah, I mean, he was incredible. I mean, there's a reason that he was, you know, one of the finalists, obviously, for Rookie of the Year, and it's also one of those things, like you mentioned, there's like it's such a finely tuned machine in DC. Like, you wonder if he comes back, like, did we just basically see him scratching the surface, like being
Right.
the first year in the system? Like, is he going to come back next year and like become something that's just like even better and even fits in even more than he already appeared to? Because you have to imagine, I mean, it's first year in the system. I don't care how good of a player you are, where you're coming from. Like, when you're hopping into a system with a bunch of players who have been there and have been doing it, you're going to be kind of the odd piece there, even if it's like harder to see with the naked eye from afar. You have to imagine like another year in that system, he would look even better. Like, so I hope he's back. I'd love to see what year 2 of him in DC would look like.
Well, and DC went out and actively recruited him too. Like, they saw his Beach Worlds performance where France won the gold, and he absolutely was kind of a singular product that they went out and got. And so, to your point, yeah, absolutely. It felt like he just stepped into that role, took it for his own, and now what could he do in year 2? Rounding out the second team all rookie selections, Jasper Dean from Seattle, Jake Felton, the assist leader from the 2024 season from Detroit, also getting a nomination. Nandaman Fink from Colorado, joined by his teammate Zeke Thorison on the second team for all rookie. Jonah Stang Osborne from Boston, Gabe Vordick from Madison, and John Wellers from Carolina, rounding out the final selections for the team nominations in the UFA season awards. Now, Time to get to the spicy section. We're going to talk about snubs. Each of us are going to take one player from each of the kind of grouped teams. So the all UFA nominations, the all defense, and the all rookie. Cam, I'll let you start with your snub from the all UFA selections.
Yeah, sure. And, you know, I do want to preface this with just like, this is really hard. Like, as somebody who used to be on the outside of the voting circle and got my first taste of it this year, and we mentioned that this year maybe was a little more abnormal with like just so many people that were deserving. Y'all, I can attest, this is hard. I had to send a draft of mine to Adam just so he could. I'll tell you the hardest part for me. I don't know what it is for you. For me, it was like I'm an includer. Like I want to like it's a strength of mine. It's great for when I'm teaching. It's terrible for when I'm picking all UFA teams. Like I want teams to be represented, and I had to get out of that mindset. Not every team needs to be represented.
Unfortunately, these are not awards to be inclusive on. As somebody
Yeah.
who also likes to be inclusive in most of my general practices in this life, like this is not the time for it.
Yeah, and I had to like really send mine to you just so I could basically have you tell me like you don't have to do this, and I'm like, okay, okay. I just needed you to tell me. Like I knew it. So when I'm talking about all UFA team, this is hard because like I did like when you look at the people who made it, I did vote for most of these people. Will Brandt, I also didn't have on my roster or on my list, and I think the one that is I'm gonna say for my snub, it's gonna be Jordan Kerr. And it's hard because I think what happened and the reason he got left off this list for so many people is because he got off to the strong start that he's gotten off to the two previous seasons in Salt Lake, looked like he was going to be an MVP contender. And then, he had the broken finger and missed a game, and then definitely had a weaker back half of the schedule than he did the first half. And also, Salt Lake as a team was performing much worse in the second half of the season, and they fell under expectations. They didn't make championship weekend. And I think all of this kind of played into people kind of forgetting still what an impactful player he was throughout the year. Because when you look at the numbers, when you look at the impact he had, it was still 100% there. It's not like it went away. He still led the shred in plus minus. He completed 96% of his passes, so he wasn't turning the disc over. Despite missing a game, he was still like almost their leader in yard. Like he still was the do everything. He still was the engine of this team that was still really good. Like they didn't finish as strongly as I think we thought that they would coming into the season. And they definitely started more on a high note and kind of never reached back to that point throughout the rest of the season. But this guy was still incredibly effective when you look at his whole body of work, and still I think was deserving of at minimum a third team mention. So that 100% is where my eyes go to for a snub. And it's not just because he's a big name. It's because he actually did have a really good season. And I think people just forgot about it because his biggest moments were just too early.
Well, and to me, his value is in the red zone. And what Salt Lake most wants to do is work it down into the end zone, red zone, and then let Kerr take over and sort of punch in all those opportunities. And you could just feel after that right hand injury, his non-throwing hand in the middle of the season, it just got different. Like he couldn't be the focal point. And because of that, everything else kind of came loosely undone, where it was just like, yeah, the sort of rhythm and the efficiency and the movement and the fast pace and the take the first look opportunity that the Salt Lake offense was so built on in their first 2+ seasons just suddenly became different. And to me, to your point, like that's what communicated how valuable Kerr was and how still good of a season he had. I mean, you look through those first 6-7 weeks. I mean, like we were saying at the beginning of this episode, he was like an MVP candidate. And yet he gets an unfortunate injury. It limits his capacity as a receiver. He can't be the kind of dual threat that he's so known for. And it just sort of impacted and constrained all the rest of the opportunity for Salt Lake. My all UFA snub, Ben Lewis from Houston.
Yep.
I mean, I've been a big eBay fan for years. I thought he was one of the more underrated performers, even when he was with Dallas. You know, you talk about a a down roster defender who just got stuff done in their one-on-one matchups, that was Lewis. And in 2024, he just went to a different level. I mean, starting with his debut where he had like plus 15 or something against
He's
Dallas.
like 14 or 15, yeah.
Oh my God, he had some sort. What was the actual stat line? I've got to go look it up. It was almost like a 5.95. It was something just
Yeah, it was like
insane.
9 goals, 5 assists, 5 blocks, or something crazy like that.
Just a kind of 4 assists, 9 goals, 3 blocks, plus 14, and he had almost 700 total yards. He had 554 receiving yards. He had 2 different 500 receiving yard games. And I know the first one was against Dallas. The second one was at Atlanta. So you can't really turn your nose up at this dude's counting stats. And it just sort of gets to the overall impact that Ben Lewis has. You know, it's one of those things where in some of the ways in which counting stats get recorded in the UFA, if you're on a lesser team, you can still rack up a lot of impressive numbers. And yet I felt like for all of the sort of NASA level, again, counting stats that Lewis had, it still undersold his actual impact. Again, he finishes top 10 in total scores with 64. He ties Austin Taylor. He had 15 total blocks, putting him within easily the top 20 of the league. And just how all of those came about as the number one receiver, as the number one defender when he would be on those points is just illustrative of the kind of player that he is. Again, if he were to play on like a Carolina or a Minnesota or a Seattle and be able to slot in a bit and not just do everything like he does for this Havoc team, it's insane to think, I think, to consider the kind of efficiency numbers he could come up with, or if he could maybe lead the league in receiving yards if he was just a number one wide receiving target on a team with a good offense. Lewis was just so impressive to me in so many different capacities outside of the production. His leadership, his highlight ability, like he just did it. To me, he was one of the top 21 players in the league this season, but I understand that he couldn't quite make one of the rosters.
I had him on my. I had both of these players on my ballot. So yeah, Ben Lewis is definitely falling. I think falls victim to the I was on a team that only beat Dallas, and that's understandable. Like I 100% get it. On the other hand, we have Alec Wilson-Holiday on there, who I also voted for, who didn't win a game this year. So it's like that's where it was kind of hard. Like I thought they were both deserving, but I can understand why maybe he got left off. But man, yeah, I agree with your assessment completely. Had he been on a different team, I think he probably makes an All-UFA team easily without anybody, doubting it whatsoever.
Well, and Alec Wilson-Holiday is the first person since 2019 to score 60-plus goals in a 12-game regular season. Quinton Bonad did it with Montreal in 2019, and Alec Wilson-Holiday is the first player to lead the league in that category in just the regular season. So I think that's kind of his merit in that category. But I put both of those Texas players, Alec Wilson-Holiday and Ben Lewis, on my ballot, just to kind of speak to their individual significance for those teams. But we should move on to our all defensive snubs. Who do you got?
Oh gosh, this was the hardest team to pick. We were talking about this in the pre-show.
There's almost 2 lines of honorable mentions for the all defensive teams, just to let listeners know. Like there was an absolute pandemonium kind of voting process for these teams.
Yeah, and it's really hard too because like how do you quantify what a good defender is? Like you can go to blocks, but if you just go straight up blocks numbers, you're going to end up with all kinds of names on there of like, it can kind of go anywhere. And I don't even remember who I originally was going to say here, to be honest, but I think I'm going to go with John Wellers from Carolina. One of many names I could pull off here. I could pull a Thomas Edmonds off here too, or a Jasper Dean, a Christian Belis. John Wellers didn't play as many games as some of these other players, but like when you look at the impact he was able to have with the games that he did play, I mean, he was, playing like his hair was on fire all the time. It almost kind of reminds me in a different way of like Lucas Ambrose, where you just feel like Lucas Ambrose is always this like energy flying around the field. John Wellers is a much bigger body and does it in a different way, but he's kind of that same type of like hair on fire player where he's just go, go, go all the time. I also thought he had an incredible championship weekend. I thought he played particularly well in the championship game against Minnesota, where he had a couple of big moments on defense and also multiple times, two or maybe even three times, was able to, on the counterattack, just strike deep and catch a really, a 60-yard pass downfield. And him and Christian Bilas both were phenomenal. I think you could make a strong argument for either of them from Carolina. But John Wellers is the one I'm going to go with. Like, man, I just felt like he was such a high impact player in the games he was available, and I'd be really curious to see what a full season of him looks like.
He's a prototype athletically, man. I mean, he is just broad-shouldered, can get up, can run, can box you out, can be physical. Like, he really tracks as a kind of defensive talent to monitor going forward, in addition to the fact that he already has a all-rookie second-team nomination. I know you wanted him on all defense, which I think is pretty deserved given how he performed at the end of the season. For me, a couple of players that I just want to mention. Christian Bilas from Carolina as well, the other rookie sensation for their D-line. He performed phenomenally. Thomas Edmonds and A.J. Merriman for DC, both of them for differing reasons being really central to why the Breeze had one of the best defensive teams in 2024. But my snub has to be Boston Glory's Brendan McCann. He's been a kind of team leader in this league that I think has been really undersold for a number of years. He started on Detroit, played in Minnesota for a year. He's been platooning around. He's been on Boston since they became a franchise in 2021. But it felt like this year was the year in which he really underpinned his ability to make an impact for the Glory. Last year, he had his season shortened due to an unfortunate injury. This year, despite maybe not the biggest block totals, all those takeaways are coming in the handler space. He's getting layout blocks on resets. He's getting hand blocks, most notably against New York when Boston got their first victory ever against the Empire. He had that late game hand block to change the course for the Glory. He's one of those guys who I think if you had any kind of contact with Brandon McCann, he's just a leader. He's just somebody who people instinctually follow. I know talking with Brandon Madison, Minnesota, even in his sort of transplant year with the wind chill, McCann made an impact there. Like, he just has a way of impacting how you play the game. And I felt like this year, with the tools that they had and the talent that they had and the personnel that Boston had on D-line, you could see McCann's leadership really taking hold and leveling it up into the boa constrictor unit that Boston became, where they led the league in fewest points allowed. And I felt like, again, it came from that kind of very tight, in your pocket handler defense that McCann just doesn't get sold on enough.
Yeah, it's really hard to quantify like handler defense because it's not going to show up in the block numbers usually.
That's why I was so grateful that Jasper Tom made it onto an all-defensive team, because he's another one of those players where he's just frenetic in that space.
Yeah, and he had a couple of big blocks in their playoff game against Boston that were, it's like when you get a block in the handler space, it's usually like you can kind of end up with some random blocks upfield, like just being in the right place, right time, a throw's a little off. It doesn't happen nearly as much in the handler space. So much so that, like, if you watch Minnesota wind chill play defense, they kind of like they'll like double team the thrower and just kind of leave the reset open a lot because they're like, yeah, you don't get blocks in the handler space, so like, why try? It's like you have to spend a lot of effort to maybe get one every once in a while. Most of the turnovers happen downfield. So when you have somebody who can really affect the handler space in the way a guy like Brendan McCann can do it, a guy like Jasper Tom can do it, like that's extremely valuable. So yeah, it's not. I feel like we're getting a little bit smarter about how we're making all defensive teams, and how we're voting on these. I think that shows in the fact that some of these guys that made these teams aren't guys who are in even the top like 15 to 20 in blocks, but you can kind of see their handprint on the game in different ways. So we'll see. I'll be really curious, as Cameron Lacey's an example of that too, where his is more for pulling. But like, it'll be curious to see like how we continue to evolve this list and how we continue to like evaluate a person's value on defense, when we're not just looking at like takeaway numbers.
Right, because one of the things that really stood out to me as far as evaluations this year was pulling as well as counterattacking. Like your ability to affect a D-line in its ability to score breaks. And that's another way in which McCann is such a standout performer. Like he is so good, especially in the red zone when there is a break opportunity to be had. But want to move into our final snub category, the rookie teams, and I'll let you take first crack.
So I'm going to go with a combo here. So I have to double check myself. I believe Will Hoffenkamp, was he a rookie? I couldn't remember if he played like one game last year.
No, he's a rookie.
Yeah. So him and Anil Drehaus, I'm putting them as a pair, and the reason is for the reason we talked about kind of in the pre-show. They kind of canceled each other out. Pittsburgh was a team that, like, while they didn't make the playoffs, and they really kind of had a season that for the first time since 2019, I think showed some promise of like improving and becoming a team that could compete for a playoff spot. They really have been kind of this Max Shepard show for a while, where they kind of live and die by how well he plays, and if the players around him can kind of support this kind of, I don't know, like this kind of all-star play style where he's kind of the playmaker and everyone else are just kind of working around him. And Anil Drehaus and Will Hoffenkamp have been able to add some backfield consistency that they just have not had for a really long time. Probably the closest thing they've had to this was in 2019 when Thomas Edmonds was kind of manning things in the backfield. But even then, it felt a lot like the Thomas Edmonds and Max Shepard show, and a lot less like a whole team effort. And now we're kind of getting this new style of offense where it's not super high flying, it's not super flashy or fancy, but it is a lot more consistent and allows them to be a lot more competitive in games. And I think those two together ended up canceling each other out, because you kind of didn't know like who is the real like rookie player who deserves to be on a team. The answer was probably both of them. I might lean a little bit more towards Drehaus if I had to pick one, but they both have completely changed the way that offense looks. And I think going forward, if they can get buy-in from those guys moving forward, like that's the recipe for success for Pittsburgh to become a competitive team in the Central Division again, is getting that backfield locked down, especially because they're so young still. So those would be my snubs, I think.
No, those are great picks, and I feel like that complementary device is why they got split on the vote a bit. You know, I know Hoffenkamp didn't necessarily get an honorable mention. I ended up having to flip him out for a different player in my specific ballot, but I totally agree with you. You know, like Drehaus adds the vertical dimension. He's got that big wind-up flick that he can deploy and that really stretches the field for the Pittsburgh offense. Then Hoffenkamp is somebody who you can give the disc to 50-plus times in a game, and he might turn it over twice. You know, he can just operate in that backfield. He's a big thrower. He has multiple release points. He doesn't get intimidated by a double team. And them working in tandem, just to your point, feels like the kind of future for this T-Birds offense.
They're both so big, too. That's their thing. They are big-bodied boys. Like it's so you can't really get a block like on the reset space in them because they're just so wide and tall.
underrated part of that size in the handler space. It's even talking back to what we were discussing with Babbitt, where there's just an ability to play almost like a low post player in a reset space where you can just box out, put somebody on your back hip, and just retain possession and get an additional 7 seconds. And that's all that matters. And I know that Babbitt has a much more limited throwing repertoire than Hoffenkamp or Dreyhaus, but like, it speaks to the same capacity of like Hoffenkamp and Dreyhaus can just body out in the spaces in a way that it's felt like, despite having a pivot handler as illustrious and historically great as Jonathan Mass, they've lacked that kind of stability in their backfield. But I wanted to get into my snub as a final snub. Ben Field for the all-rookie team, Salt Lake Shred rookie. Felt like he was, again, a kind of sacrifice of early successes. We had a little bit of recency bias. It felt like he got shifted into multiple roles as the season progressed and as Salt Lake continued to deal with a host of different injuries on both offense and defense. But Field felt like one of those players who, if everything kept consistent and he could have just been the 5-7 developing offensive player, he would have really exploded. Because he had a couple plays early in the year where it was like, man, that hand cannon flick and that big stretchy layout form that he has, it seems like the sky is the limit. And yet, for whatever reason, due to, again, roster absences, rotating lineups, Salt Lake's dependency on kind of a strict red zone system, he just didn't quite get the play that maybe he would have on a different team. But he just feels like the kind of playmaker and athlete that Salt Lake is so in need of right now. Like, it felt like for all the growing pains in year 1, year 2, he could be a real most improved candidate or like breakout player potential.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had Ben Field on my ballot for rookie team, and he was a guy who I like had on, took off, put back on. Like, I think you're right. He fell victim to like the team success being so high early, and like honestly, a lot of his individual success was really high early, and it was later in the season. He did have some big games later in the season, but I think also something that can be hard is like he actually had a pretty good playoff game, but he also had maybe the worst turnover of the game. And that's something that kind of stick in your mind is like the most recent thing you think about, where he went to throw a reset to Grant Lindsley and threw like basically back towards their end zone. And
that was unfortunately his Achilles heel the entire season, and why Grayson Retberg got subbed in for him on offense in the middle of the season at a certain point. It was that he would make the most spectacular play, and then he would also kind of, unfortunately, make one of the most, head-scratching plays of any individual start he was a part of.
Yeah, but again, I think you're right, though. Ceiling is super high for this guy. Like, it's his first year in the league. Like he only completed about 90% of his passes, including the playoff game, which, if you're going to be playing offense, especially for one of the top offenses in the league, you got to be better than that. But like, this is year 1 for this guy. So like, I'll definitely be curious to see what his role looks like next year. Should he return? Cause he has a ceiling that I think is as high as just about anyone, as a lot of guys in the league can have when you just look at his raw athleticism and speed and height, like all those things. Like he has all the tools to be like a really top tier player in this league. He just got to work in. So, get those silly mistakes out of the way, just learn how to integrate himself into the system a little bit better. But all the tools are there. So I totally agree with your pick here on the snub. Like he can be a game changer. And I think, in Salt Lake, they have a pretty good track record in their 3 years of taking players and developing them and making them better. So if he sticks around there, I have no doubt that he will do the same.
That downfield quartet of Dunabile, Kerr, Selfridge, and Field in the beginning of part of the season really felt like it had something, especially against DC in that first week. Like when Field was ripping flicks to Selfridge running into space, like that felt like the recipe, man. And yet just something about the season kind of derailed it a bit. Again, injuries, something else. But Field feels like a prospect that has, to your point, a tremendous amount of upside. But we're now way past 90 minutes in this episode, so we're going to be wrapping it up for this season awards swing pass event. Cam and I will be signing off here tonight, but we will be back next week to do another season recap episode of the 2024 UFA campaign. We thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you haven't had a chance, go look at the UFA socials as well as the watchufa.com website. That will contain all of the additional coverage of the end of season awards, including MVP, Coach of the Year, Rookie of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, Most Improved, and all of the team selections. We will bid you adieu for now on Swing Pass, but we will be back in short order. Talk to you soon. Bye.